My Lord, it's a pleasure to follow the Noble Baroness Lady Whittaker and to endorse everything that's been said in the debate so far and so ably introduced by the Noble Lord Purvis. I particularly want to follow what Baroness Whittaker has said to the House about the suitability of some countries in Schedule 1 as places to which people should be returned, and my noble friend Lord Kerr, of course, and the Noble Baroness Lady Chakrabarti developed that point in their earlier interventions. I want to take one example, but I think the arguments I'm going to put to the House could be applied to other countries that are on the list as well, and that country is Nigeria. In a later group of amendments, I have Amendment 85C, which seeks to establish how the Secretary of State will establish equality provisions listed in Schedule 1 and the potential harm to those with protected characteristics, including, for instance, victims of modern slavery. But I specifically would like to ask the Noble Lord the Minister to engage with the issue of justice in Nigeria. This is a country where we've said it's safe to return men, but not women. And I would like to argue, my lords, it's not safe to return anybody to Nigeria, given the way that the internal factors in that country currently stand. The seriousness of the situation was underlined by the visit of Karim Khan KC, the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, who visited Nigeria in 2020. He's continuing the investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated by Boko Haram and by other factions, as well as the involvement, I might add, of the Nigerian security forces. And that investigation began in December 2020 and is continuing. Now, whether or not the ICC will determine that a genocide or crimes against humanity are being perpetrated against the religious minorities of the north of Nigeria lies in the future. But the evidence of why this is a hostile environment in which people face outright persecution is, my lords, overwhelming. Simply consider the role of what are sometimes euphemistically called bandit groups, who have been killed, abducted, forcibly converted and displaced vast numbers of people, many of whom end up in small boats. According to government figures, 4,983 women were widowed, 25,000 children orphaned, 190,000 people displaced between 2011 and 2019, with over 3 billion naira paid to bandits as a ransom for 3,672 individuals who've been abducted. In one incident last year, IS West Africa killed 8 people and kidnapped 72 people on a Kaduna-bound train from Abuja, while in 2022, Boko Haram killed at least 60 people in the Ran community, Borno State, and killed more than 15 women in the Groza community, also in Borno. In June 2022, the United Nations reported that Boko Haram and splinter factions were reported to have abducted at least 211 children, recruited at least 63 children, killed or maimed at least 88 children, raped or sexually violated 53 girls, attacked at least 15 schools. In September 22, UNESCO estimated that 20.2 million Nigerian children were out of school as a consequence. Well, I think particularly of the plight of Leah Sharibu, who's just turned the age of 20. At the age of 14, on February the 18th, 2018, she was abducted by Boko Haram, raped, impregnated, forcibly converted, one of 110 girls taken from the government Girls' Science and Technical College, Depachi, in the Yobe State. Here in your Lordship's house, I met her mother, Rebecca, and I promised I'd never miss any opportunity that might come my way to raise Leah's case. So I do so again today because it illustrates the dangers to people being sent back to Nigeria, whether they're women or men, and indeed if they come from religious minorities that don't fit a particular mindset or ideology, then they are doubly endangered. Elsewhere, of course, in the country, secessionist forces in the southeast of Nigeria and protests by the indigenous people of Biafra led to gunmen killing and maiming and destroying properties of citizens in the region. Armed forces against separatists have also been involved in at least 122 extrajudicial killings. The media reports suggest that over 287 people were killed in the southeast from January to May. Or take other rights that we take for granted, my lords. 75 years ago this year, the United Nations promulgated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 18 of which insists that everyone has the right to believe or to not believe, or to change their belief. Now, theoretically, Nigeria is signed up to Article 18 of all of the 30 articles in the UDHR. But Article 18 is honoured, as Lady Whitaker has just reminded us, only in its breach in Nigeria, and there are no safe or legal routes for those who are subjected to persecution for their religion or belief. With a cap on total numbers, there should be a safe and legal route, and no reform for certain categories of people. And I'm particularly glad that the Noble Baroness Lady Williams is here in her place today, because she knows that's an issue I've raised previously with her. And I do think, as the government now consider the creation of further safe and legal routes, and I really welcome what the government has said about this, that persecuted people might form part of that. And if it allowed for, say, 5,000 people maximum per year, that would be a great step forward for many endangered people in many parts of the world. The urgency of addressing this issue is illustrated by the case of Mubarak Bala, who is the president of the Nigerian Humanist Association, sentenced to 24 years in prison for a blasphemous post on Facebook. He received an excessive 24-year sentence, but at least he's still alive to challenge the sentence. In most cases, the extremist sentiment fueled by blasphemy laws and accusations, coupled with the impunity surrounding blasphemy-related violence, means that many of those accused never get to have their day in court and are effectively lynched, as occurred in the case of Deborah Samuel in Sokoto State. In an indication of the degree of impunity surrounding blasphemy allegations, only 3 men among the mob who killed her were arrested for beating her to death and for her immolation. They were merely charged with public disturbance as opposed to murder. Moreover, they were freed by Chief Magistrate Shaibu Hamad in January 2023 due to the absence of the police prosecution during the scheduled hearings. My Lords, Nigeria is one of 71 countries that criminalises blasphemy in a law introduced during the colonial era that contravenes the country's constitution, which theoretically allows for the freedoms of thought, conscience and expression that we all uphold in this House. It's also incompatible with the nation's international obligations with regard to those Article 18 obligations that I referred to earlier on. In addition, my Lords, the enactment of Sharia's penal codes in 12 northern states effectively rendered Islam a de facto state religion in violation of Nigeria's secular constitution, which only theoretically recognises Sharia courts for non-criminal proceedings. As well as contravening constitutional stipulations, this action effectively endowed the systematic marginalisation of followers of non-majoritarian expressions of faith that has existed for decades with quasi-legality. The Tijaniya Sufi singer Yahya Shari Aminu, whose death sentence was overturned on a technicality and following an international outcry, but who still faces a retrial and a possible death sentence, is currently petitioning the Supreme Court, challenging Nigeria's blasphemy law and the legality and constitutionality of the Kano Sharia Penal Code. And he's not alone in facing wholly unacceptable penalties for simply expressing dissent. Consider the denial of freedom of expression and arbitrary arrest, breaches of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For 7 months, my Lords, there was a ban on Twitter while the Nigerian Broadcasting Commission suspended Vision FM for criticising the government, sanctioned 4 media outlets and suspended 52 broadcast stations. The government shut down 5 pro-opposition media outlets. Last November, a Kano court sentenced social media celebrities Mubarak Mohammed and Nazivi Mohammed to detention, flogging and a fine for defaming the governor. The blogger Bashiru Hamid was detained for publishing the criminal record of the Ogun State governor. Journalists Abu Rashid Akogun and Dare Akon were detained for WhatsApp messages that alleged Kwara State governor's corruption. People's Gazette staff were arrested for a newspaper article that was said to defame the former Chief of Army Staff, with Umaru Maradun detained for undisclosed reasons. Meanwhile, radio worker Kazmir Uzema was detained for airing an offensive song. Or recall that several prominent End SARS activists were obliged to flee the country in an irregular manner after surviving the Lekki tollgate massacre in October 2020 and following a harsh crackdown. Among those who stayed, 9 detained protesters were only acquitted and released by a judge in Oyo State in January 23, and at least 30 remain in pre-trial detention across the country. My Lords, I'm telling the House all this because we are going to send people back to Nigeria. We've said it's a safe place for men. This cannot be right, my Lords. Does anything I've said to the House suggest that this is a safe country to which people should be returned? Many refugees or asylum seekers flee their countries after facing injustice, mistreatment, harsh imprisonment without due process, and even threats to their lives on account of peaceful political protest or on account of their religion or belief. Nigeria is also a nation on the edge of precipice. It represents nearly 3% of the global population in extreme poverty, with the emergence of a critical security vacuum that has resulted in citizens across the country facing terrorism or violent armed groups and being commoditised as abductions for ransom have unfortunately become a growth industry. The UN says that 1.4 million people are internally displaced. Over 95 million Nigerians are living in poverty, and food inflation reached 22% in July 2022. As I draw to an end, my Lords, as violence by non-state actors continues, the economic and political climate remains uncertain following the inauguration of a president whose victory remains disputed and who in any case belongs to the party that oversaw Nigeria's critical decline. Observers warn of a final descent into failed statehood, which in turn could spark an exodus of people legitimately in need of safety. In the absence of defined legal or regular routes for those seeking refuge in the UK, who perhaps have family or other ties to the country, these people would also be denied entry. Not only does this suggest that what we categorise as a safe country does not match the reality, it also illustrates why this bill misses the point. With over 100 million people displaced in the world, we need a strategy to tackle the root causes, not legislation which will do nothing to end the desperate journeys of people who are desperate to make better and safer lives for themselves and for their families.
My Lords, I will not